Although we just had client validation working on our view, it's only going to work for those built-in attributes like the required attribute, the range attribute, string length, and regular expression. For the custom validation attribute that we built, the greater than date attribute, we currently do not support client-side validation, but it's easy enough to add. In fact, it's easier in MVC 3 than it was in MVC 2, as long as you know a little bit about jQuery.validate, about that plugin. There's basically 3 steps to the process. First, we're going to implement iClientValidatable on our custom validation attribute that tells the MVC runtime that this attribute supports client-side validation, and we'll need to implement a method that puts together some metadata for the runtime. Then we're going to switch over into ClientScript and implement a jQuery validation method and implement an adapter that takes the metadata and puts it into the format that the jQuery validation plugin understands. Step 1 in the process. Let's implement iClientValidatable, that's in the MVC namespace, and we need to implement a method called getClientValidationRules. GetClientValidationRules needs to return a collection of model client validation rules that's essentially metadata that's going to be sent to the client in the data dash attributes when we're using unobtrusive JavaScript. In this case, we only need to return a single validation rule. So let me create an instance of a model client validation rule. We're going to set the error message for what happens if validation fails to the result of format error message. So we can reuse our format string and say format this with the metadata that we're getting about the model metadata. Format it with model metadata dot get display name. So that's our error message. And now we need to set the validation type. Validation type is essentially going to be a magic string. And this magic string will have to match up with a magic string that we have in JavaScript. I'll show you that just a bit, but imagine this as an identifier to select what rule or what function we need to execute on the client side. We're also going to need to pass along some parameters. So in this case, we need to pass along what this other property is. What is the name of that? And we're going to assume that the view will render with an input that has the name that matches this other property name. This is what the MVC views will do by default when you use things like editor for and label for. They're going to create a name, in this case, a name with this input text box that matches the name of the property. So the name of this input would be ours. So if we just pass along the other property name, then we should be able to find the other input from our client validation scripts. And finally, now that we've put that rule together, we just need to return it. And we can return multiple validation rules, so to build the IEnumerable, we'll use yield return. Now it's time to write some client-side script. So let me come to the script folders and add a new item. We want to add a JScript file, and I will call this custom validations, because any other custom validations that come along, we can put them here inside of the same file. And before I forget, let me come into the create view and make sure that we add this script. So I'll drag it here from the Solution Explorer window and then just fix it up a little bit to use the URL.content helper. That'll make sure that the path is always resolved correctly. So now custom validations is in place. Here in the JavaScript file, I'm going to pull in some references so that I have great IntelliSense inside of Visual Studio. I know I'm going to be using jQuery. I know I'm going to be using jQuery validate. And I know that I'm going to be using jQuery.validate.unobtrusive. These references just give me better IntelliSense in Visual Studio. And now we finally have all the infrastructure in place to start acting on step 2. Step 2 is to write that method that plugs into the jQuery validators to actually perform the validation. And the way you do this is to go to jQuery.validator and invoke a method called addMethod. The first thing we need to specify is the method name. This name is going to match an adapter name, which is going to match this name that I have here. Technically, all 3 don't have to match, but I'm going to use the same string literal everywhere. So add a method called greater, And the second parameter here is the function that actually does the validation. This function takes 3 parameters. The value that's coming in, so the end date, the element that that value is in, and then any additional parameters. Our parameter is going to be the identifier of that other date that we need to compare ourselves to. So we need to take this value and compare it to what is inside of the element identified by this parameter. And this method returns true or false. If it returns true, validation succeeded. If it returns false, something went wrong, and jQuery.validate will automatically display an error message for us. So we're going to parse our value into a date, and we're going to make sure that we are greater than what we parse out of this other parameter. So to make sure we get the value, I'm going to wrap it with jQuery and use .val to pull out the value. The third step that we need to take is to write an adapter that essentially adapts the MVC metadata that's going into HTML into options for the jQuery validation plugin. This is done by going to jQuery.validator.unobtrusive.adapters and saying I want to add one. This is going to be the greater adapter. So this string has to match our validation type. Greater. And then the second parameter here, if you look in the IntelliSense, the parameters that I need. So I'm going to say that my parameter is called other, and this string literal has to match the name of this literal that's in the validation parameters metadata that we produced from the server side. Those 2 strings have to match. And then finally, there will be a function called that gets an options parameter. And it's the responsibility of this function to take information and put it into the options. It's these options that the jQuery Validate plugin will look at so that it executes the validation rules. So the first thing we need to say is that we want you to invoke the greater method. That's what we've defined up here. So these 2 string values have to match. Invoke that method, and a parameter that I want to pass along is a thing called other that I get out of options.param.other. And this is actually options.params.other. Essentially what I'm doing is I'm taking this value, this other property name, it's going to be sent to the client for us. I'm extracting that and I'm going to send it along in a way that jQuery Validate will pass it in to the actual function that does the validation. I'm just going to preface it with a £sign so that it becomes essentially a jQuery selector. And when we do $param, it'll just be able to find that input. And finally, inside of this options object, there is also a messages collection. And I need to specify that when this rule fails, here is the error message to use. Options.message will automatically be populated for me based on the information that I put into this error message property here. So essentially, we're taking the metadata that we put together in this validation rule, and we're adapting it here into jQuery.validation options, which we can then use inside of a validation function. If we have implemented this all correctly, then we should be able to save this and hit Control F5, come into the Create view, and we know this part of client validation works. If I enter a 3 and a 4, I know that part of client validation works. But what happens if I enter 131 and 110 here? Well, that was client validation. End date must be greater than start date. If I come back and change this, let's change 131 to 120, and let's change 120 to 131. The message immediately goes away. So our client validation code is working. And just to demystify this perhaps a little bit more, let's look in the HTML source code here, and this is the input that will hold the end date. And you can see it has a data-val equals true that says validation is enabled here. And it has a data-val greater in our error message. That's essentially saying, invoke this thing called greater, and here's going to be the error message that it should use. And here is the other parameter that we need, data-val-greater.other. So that's how the start date property name was passed along to us. That was extracted for us and passed along as a parameter into this method that we just put into the jQuery rules, which in turn was passed as this parameter element. So a few moving pieces here, but believe me, this is actually a little bit easier than it was in MVC 2. It involves considerably less code. It's also unobtrusive, and jQuery.validation is a pretty powerful validation library.